This session of The Long View is looking at how environment, sustainability, energy, cities, innovation, technology, capital, and the commercial ingenuity of people and enterprises can be forces that we have to grapple with in a hard way, but can be solutions as we look to the future. My name is Chris Henderson. I'm the president of Lumos Energy and senior advisor at the Globe Foundation. It's my pleasure to be your moderator and to introduce our panel. Sitting beside me is Marc, who is a recovering politician. Not doing a good job, by the way. Beside him is a 40-year-old fossil from the capital markets industry, Mike Brown. We'll see how that goes. In the middle, giving us some real liveliness to the panel, is Mary Polak, the Minister of Environment for British Columbia. Delighted to have her here. Beside Mary is Marc Gunther, who is editor-at-large. I always like the term editor-at-large, Marc, or is it just large editor from the Guardian Group? And finally, Bruce Anderson from Abacus, who's a public opinion observer for the last 30 years. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to be turning in order to Mike and on to Bruce, who for the next 3 or 4 minutes will share their remarks in a very different spaces and perspectives they all have, talking very much to what are the challenges in the long view, but particularly starting with the opportunities and what we have to grapple with, and if we don't grapple with, the consequences of that. And then put out 1 or 2 things for your discussion. Twitter feed is up all the time. The hashtag is the number 4, Ward, 4, W-A-R-D, at Globe. There you see right in front of you, forward at Globe. Where do we go at Globe? Put your comments, your perspectives, your challenges up there. When we go to Q&A in about a half an hour, we're going to go to the mics alone, not to Twitter feed. So with no further ado, Mike, you have the first word.
Thank you, Chris. I want to take a little survey of the audience. First of all, how many of you live in a rural area of your country? How many of you live in a city? Welcome to the 21st century, the urban century, Homo urbanus. That's what we are. We're an urban species. And we have never added more people to cities than at the present time. We're adding the equivalent of 2 Chinas to the world cities over a 30-year period. And Booz Allen has done a study that shows that we're going to need $350 trillion to be invested in cities, half of that private sector and the other half public-private partnership and public infrastructure, if we have any chance of creating a quality of life for people living in cities. So stick that in your head, because that is the economic mega project that we can crank up to rescue the dying GDP growth-based economy we've been relying on for the last 50, 60 years. The way that we do cities is going to influence what Mike Brown is very passionate about, climate change. And if we copy the old model of cities, which I kept telling my friends in China when I was mayor of Vancouver and premier in British Columbia, please don't copy Detroit. Do not copy the North American model of a dead downtown, 9 to 5 business downtown, and sprawled suburbs that are too spread out so you can only get around by cars and freeways. If you do that, you're not going to like the air pollution problem you're going to have. Well, the Chinese didn't listen, and now Harbin, a city in northern China, had an air pollution problem that went beyond the bad air, which is 25 parts per million, and hit 1,000 2 weeks ago. Now, how do you live in that kind of an atmosphere? Well, the Chinese government, to its credit, has turned on a dime, and last year decided to invest $9 trillion to start to undo the damage that phony model created. Detroit, it's too late, right? Detroit is now a bankrupt city where the solution is to tear down basically a third to half the city. Population's gone from 1.8 million to 700,000 people. Paris just ordered people to drive cars in opposite days because of the air pollution problem. And if you're Canadian, how many of you are Canadians? Anybody from Montreal? Anybody from Toronto? Well, we should declare those 2 cities national to catastrophes.
So is that a Rob Ford thing, or?
I'm just getting to that part. We've got one city that has a cocaine snorting, booze guzzling idiot for a mayor.
No.
Badly governed, and a $50 billion backlog of transit, $6 billion a year of congestion costs. Then you go to Montreal, corrupt, incompetently run, crumbling infrastructure, $9 billion of leaky water pipes, the Champlain Bridge. Who goes across that? Don't. So our cities are in deep trouble, and there are solutions. Guelph, for example, I helped to put together a sustainable city strategy 6 years ago. They have a community energy plan. They're carrying it out. And the result of having more compact green buildings, people living close to where they work, different ways of doing transportation, sewer, water, waste management, is by 2030 they're going to have a 60% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions per capita and a 50% reduction in per capita energy use. So my point is cities are all about choices. We're an urban species. We better get cities right in the next 25, 30 years. And it's a huge, huge economic opportunity that's going to allow us to move from the GDP feeling, growth-based, more economy, more consumption, consuming the equivalent of 4 Earths. We can't. There's only one Earth, right? I was going to do a quiz. How many Earths have we got? We need to change to an enough economy that ecological economists have been working on for quite a while and live within the confines of one Earth. I think we can do it, but it's going to mean that since the first globe to now we have failed, we've got to do twice as much work in the next 25 years. So when we hit globe 2025, we can say we made it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I always enjoy listening to my good friend Mike, who has made an amazing transition from being a socialist guy to being a real entrepreneur. He still is very entrepreneurial in the socialist type things that he likes to do, but I can tell you that he's a real life business guy as well. So great marks to Mike.
Do good and do well at the same
time. Oh
time.
yeah, like why not? So he and I come from a bit of a different perspective on some of these challenges and things. I'm a capital markets guy. I've been doing these venture capital things for much longer than most of you in this room have been born, since you were born. And I believe that we have to start getting realistic about the nature of the challenges, and I don't think we are. I think we're unduly optimistic, and I'll explain in a minute or two why I use that term. So, you know, you got to hope for the best and plan for the worst. And so what are the challenges that I see? Well, I see them on a kind of a global scale, that we've got these 3 major issues. We have to maintain a standard of living that was enabled for us by access to really inexpensive, dense, liquid fuels, fossil fuels. They provided the ability to borrow money, earn surpluses, and it's a tendency that we carry on today, even though the cost of those fossil fuels, or almost any energy, is escalating. The amount of energy required to get access to a barrel of energy keeps going up. At the same time, we can't ignore the climate problem. Mike referred to the fact that I'm a climate nut bar, which is true. In fact, one of my prouder things is for the city of Vancouver, for a different mayor, mind you. I helped put together a task force to study the issue of climate change and the impact on the city of Vancouver 25 years ago. And not a lot has changed. I believe that unless we face the prospect that within the next century, the parts per million will hit at least 600, then we're not going to take adequate action. And it's going to be very difficult to do these 3 things at once: the carbon problem, keep the cost of energy low, and maintain a standard of living. In fact, I believe that unless we solve all 3 problems at once, we're not going to solve any of them. And on top of that, I've been trying to understand why we have such trouble with policy issues when it comes to climate change. And so recently I read a book that, quite frankly, was a very difficult book. Maybe because I'm getting old, it's harder to understand things. Anyway, the title of the book was Denial and the Origin of the Human Mind. And the premise in the book is that we are all physiologically, not psychologically, but physiologically programmed to deny the ultimate realities of our existence. that we have self-selected over generations for an ability to do things like deny our own mortality on the basis that if we couldn't do that, we simply couldn't function. The problem is that that denial reflex applies to other really serious things. And in short order, won't go into all of it, I believe that's a reason why there will not be political action and policies that can truly address the climate change problem. And as the problem gets worse, the solutions are going to get harder. They're going to become more severe, they're going to become more expensive, they're becoming less politically acceptable. The notion that humanity can work this out on its own is going to pass some sort of a threshold of no return unless we are extraordinarily fortunate. And good fortune in my perspective means we got to find some miracles. And I don't mean loaves of bread and fish and so on, though I guess it's possible. But I do mean miracles in the sense of technology change that is completely unanticipated today. There are some examples of those kinds of miracles. There's one in Burnaby, as a matter of fact, that I've had a little bit to do with. We're not supposed to do commercials here, so
I'll do it for you.
He'll do it for me. Okay. It's the fusion opportunity, because that truly is the kind of change that we need, and we need lots of them. The problem is that almost all of those breakthrough technologies are composed of hardware. They're not software. They're not the standard, relatively inexpensive thing that you can do from a capital perspective. These things are going to require cycles of innovation, of test. It's going to require massive amounts of extremely patient money that is going to have to accept the premise that for a 15 to 20 to 30-year time frame during which these miracles will take to emerge, there's no return. So my view is governments are going to have great trouble funding these things because of the very problem I talked about maintaining standards of living. Surpluses are not as easy to accumulate by anybody. Governments won't have that kind of access to funds. So without unlocking the door from the private sector, as I put it, the blood on the floor of the Colosseum is going to get deeper. So I was asked to think about what the opportunities are, and I think there are two. The first one is all of you who are aspiring entrepreneurs and innovators, think of the miracles that you can produce, and think of what the change is going to be as a consequence of your finding those miracles. And to those of you who are in financial markets and services, see if you can't figure out a way to improve access to long-term, patient, permanent capital.
Thank you. That's great.
Shall I dive in?
Dive in.
How many of you have grandchildren in the audience? Oh, there you go. Everybody. I don't yet, if my daughter's listening somewhere. Toddlers, that's the age I'm thinking of. Have you ever watched them use your iPad or your smartphone? Isn't it amazing the fact that while it takes me several hours to figure out a new app, and sometimes I can't even figure out how to install it, you hand over your iPad, your smartphone to that toddler, and pretty soon they've probably figured out your password and they've downloaded new music that you didn't even know existed. I think those represent some of the types of miracles that we're going to see as young people who think differently than folks like myself or the others up here. They process differently. They risk differently. They calculate risk differently. They expect different things from their world than we expected. I believe they expect different things from themselves. I'm amazed my daughter's 26 years old, and talking with her about her expectations with respect to life and what she can accomplish is a very different experience than what I would have thought of at her age. We're in a very interesting generation as parents now. We are one of the first generations, I won't say the first, I think we passed that milestone a little while before my time, but we are one of the first generations who cannot look our kids square in the face and tell them what life and the world is going to be like. 100 years ago, mom, dad could sit down with the kids and say, this is how life is going to work. This is how you get a job. This is what your house will be like. By the way, you're probably taking over the family farm or the family business. And by and large, mom and dad would have been correct. I can tell my 26-year-old absolutely nothing. Nothing. With respect to what her world is going to be like when she's my age. Nothing. I could guess. I probably have a 50-50 chance of being right or wrong. But I can't tell her that. That can be a scary prospect. But as I think of the toddler with the smartphone and the iPad, I actually think it's terribly exciting. There is nothing that human ingenuity can't overcome. That's what I believe. Now, we have important choices to make. And we do have a tendency as human beings to be like the frog in the pot of cold water when the burner gets turned on, and instead of jumping out, we just kind of feel like maybe the water's warming up a bit, and before long it's too late and we don't jump out. That's our tendency, though. We are surrounded, though, by a world of young people who don't take their information the same way that we used to. My daughter, I don't think, has ever read a newspaper. She doesn't have cable vision because she watches television on her laptop. So she's never seen the 6 o'clock news. I don't think she's ever flipped on CKNW or CFAX or anything else. But she knows what's going on in the world. I ask her, well, how do you know? Well, I look for things on Twitter and Facebook, and if something interests me, then I go and look for it, and I look for the information, and I find out. Completely different way of accessing and processing information. The same is true when it comes to young entrepreneurs. The same is true when it comes to young researchers. The same is true when it comes to plotting their future. I can't look at their world and understand how it is they look ahead and figure that out. I am prepared to be amazed by what the new group of entrepreneurs in the clean tech and clean energy sector are going to come up with, because I think we will be amazed. I think rather than looking at our world and the challenges of taking action on climate, rather than looking at that as challenges that are just too huge to overcome, I am prepared to be amazed by young people who decide that they're going to create a new career for themselves because they're going to create a completely new line of business. They're going to create something that makes resource extraction a completely different proposition, that makes fueling our world a completely different proposition. I don't think it's just a hope. I really do believe that that's what we're going to witness. It is going to take some of the initiatives that you've already heard outlined, and I'm sure you'll hear a few more. And maybe one of the most significant challenges in that is for policymakers who are in my age group and older, not just to find the political will to create financing opportunities, to find that patient capital, but we are also going to have to find ways to reach out to those new minds, that new thinking, and not just apply the way we think those things will work best for them, but ask them. And I would ask you, if you have thoughts on it here today, what is it that you think you need governments to do to make that possible? I might be able to come up with an idea that maybe relates back to the way governments always do things. You look at different financial incentives and initiatives over the last 30 years, and Mike, I don't think it's really changed in terms of methodology. It's all very similar. We've always done it the same way. We can't. We have to hear from you. What are the things that leaders in business can do? What are the things that governments can do that are not just new and innovative in the buzzword kind of a sense, but truly respond to the needs of a world that we cannot predict, but one that you as a young entrepreneur must live in? Thanks very much. Look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. So the website that I oversee and write for is called Guardian Sustainable Business, and we look at the relationship between business and the environment. And having covered this for some time, I think we've been through 2 phases, and I hope we're about to enter a third. Phase 1 was compliance. Essentially, companies were forced, mostly through regulation, to play by the rules. They had a relatively unfriendly relationship with both their regulators and the environmental movement. Phase 2, which began 10 or 15 years ago, I would describe as an efficiency-driven phase where companies put out social and environmental sustainability reports. They formed alliances with environmental groups. There was a lot of what I call sustainability by anecdote. Look at us, we put a solar panel on the roof, or we have 1 out of our 22 plants that generates no waste. But neither of those 2 phases have gotten us where we need to go. The pace of the scale of the problem has outpaced our ability to deal with the problem, particularly around climate. So I think we need to move to a phase 3, a much more transformative phase where business, government, NGOs, consumers somehow come together to really transform the economy we have now into something different. And that different economy has been called the circular economy, where we eliminate not only waste, but the very idea of waste. It would be an economy powered by low carbon or no carbon fuels that wouldn't eliminate necessarily oil and gas, but we'd have to capture the carbon generated by oil and gas. And the real challenge will be, as others have said, to decouple economic growth from environmental impact. That's the way we want to think. We've got to keep growing the economy, but limiting our environmental impact. So easy to say, how do we get from here to there? I see 3 promising things happening that if we scale up and accelerate them could get us there. The first, clearly, is better policy. Particularly in the U.S., we have a very both ineffective and inefficient carbon climate policy. It's encouraging to see that both Alberta and BC have adopted carbon pricing. What we need to find in the U.S. is a bipartisan, business-friendly movement to put a price on carbon. If we don't do that, almost anything else we do is probably going to be a waste of time, because without a carbon price, we won't have the policy drive that will get us the kind of technological breakthroughs people are talking about here. The second thing is much more cross-industry, pre-competitive efforts to solve environmental problems. And we've seen stirrings of this in the U.S. There's something called the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, where companies that normally compete have gotten together around improving both the social conditions in their supply chain and measuring the environmental footprint of their products. So they'll compete on style and price and other things, but they're not going to compete around environmental performance or the safety of the workplaces where their clothes are made. I've been really impressed to learn this week about the collaborative efforts by the Canadian oil and gas industry in the oil sands area, where those, I think it's called COSIA, where 13 companies have come together to pool their intellectual property and really attack some of the environmental issues there. So that kind of effort to drive system change across entire industries or up and down supply chains, I think holds a lot of promise, and again gets us past the panels on the roof approach to sustainability. The third, and this I think is a very tough one, is we've got to awaken the green consumer or discover the green consumer wherever he or she may be. I was struck a few months ago when I did an interview with a top executive at McDonald's. They were working on fair trade, sustainable, best kind of coffee, and told me in Europe all their coffee is going to meet those standards, but in North America it's only going to be their espresso, which is a very small portion of their coffee sales. So why take one approach in Europe and another one in North America? Because in Europe the consumer expectation of the company to be an environmentally solid performer is much higher than here in the U.S., and they weren't going to get rewarded, or not here in the U.S., but back in the U.S., they weren't going to get rewarded by the American consumer for doing the right thing. If we can figure out how to enlist and awaken consumers in this effort, they are a real drag right now on what business I think knows needs to be done and would like to do. So those three things, carbon pricing, systemic efforts, and awaken consumer, might, and I say might, get us where we need to go. My last thought is we need to have a serious conversation about geoengineering, because if, in fact, those other things don't get us where we need to go, that could be our kind of next step solution to buy the time that we need to bring the technologies, the low carbon, clean technologies to scale that will be the long-term solution to the problem.
Well, good morning. I am an unqualified optimist about this question of what the world is going to turn out like in terms of sustainability over the next 25 years. I believe, as one of the panelists has said, that it takes a miracle to accomplish some of what probably needs to happen, but I do believe that the miracle exists and we know it, we understand it as human will. I find that I've studied public opinion around environmental issues for about 25 years now, and I started to see in the 1980s the evolution of a change in the ethics of Canadians when it came to the footprint that we're willing to leave on the planet. And you could see it first among people on the left of the spectrum and among people of younger generations. But within a matter of a very few years, you started to see it spread to people on the right and the center of the spectrum and to older people. And one of the things that I'm struck by most these days is that when I first started studying public opinion, I was taught how to study it. The professors that taught me explained that what we know about public opinion, in particular in terms of voting behavior, is that young people tend to vote on the basis of what their parents tell them is the right choice, and that women tend to vote on the basis of what their husbands tell them are the right choices. And of course, if you looked at the data at that time, this is dating me, it was, those were theses that you could support with data, let me put it that way. And I've been testing those in the last several years. And what I know is going on in households across the country is that women have more influence than they ever did on the political choices that are being made by family members and extended circles in the community. And in traditional households, I'll find pretty large numbers of men who say, I don't vote without checking on how my wife is thinking about the choices. More importantly, for the purposes of the 25-year outlook, young people are having a huge impact on our political culture. They're having an impact on the views and the priorities that their parents embrace and support in terms of political choice. They're having a huge impact on the consumer choices that are being made in the household or by the household. And this change is happening by osmosis. If I could look at the challenge of where we're at today on the environmental issues and where we're at in the future, I think it's a question of there is now a widespread sense of moral obligation to do more of the right things and less of the wrong things. Whether or not that becomes a moral imperative or a political imperative, I think is a trickier question. I think that we were on a path towards seeing more imperatives in terms of policy solutions, but a couple of things got in the way. One was the development of the developing economies in the sense that economic interests were colliding, and that the discussion in particular around climate change became a discussion of how do we in the developed world take the necessary steps knowing that we're going to cede some economic ground to another part of the world that is already looking like it's going to catch on fire and surpass us at some point. Now, that whole discussion reflects an attitude, and Mary's speaking about this, of people of my generation and my expectations. The idea that everything has to start with what do we want to get out of the world, and there's an economic answer to that, isn't the same when I look at people under 35 today. And so if I thought that people like me, don't mean necessarily of my value system, but my age and with my roots and the DNA that I was kind of born with and learned to live with, if I thought that we were going to stay the same age and have the same influence on public policy for the next 25 years, which is impossible, then I would say, well, maybe we're not going to make very much progress. But that's not going to be the case. It's going to be your daughter, it's going to be my daughters, and I know how they live, and I know how they think. Now, how will that translate? Will they know exactly what to do in terms of fixing those markets, the financial markets in particular? Do they have the big policy ideas right now? I don't think so, but I don't think there's anything but abundant evidence that if they want to do something, they'll be able to accomplish it, including restructuring financial markets, creating new rewards for new sources of inspiration. So I'm a huge believer in that. There's one other thing that I would like to say, though, or maybe two quick things. One is that people in public life, in public policy and politics, have tended to look upon these issues either as sources of division sometimes that can be mined for political success, which is a very destructive thing, but not necessarily so destructive for the planet. It's kind of destructive for politics. It turns people off and away from politics, and that's been a pervasive thing. But younger people, having turned away from politics, will come back to the public policy process when they see it being willing to fashion more optimistic, more positive, more future-oriented solutions. And again, if you ask me, will today's political history as it's played out now repeat itself for the next 25 years? I think absolutely not. And if you doubt me on that, just think about what's happened to attitudes and public policy inclinations around issues like same-sex marriage and legalization or decriminalization of marijuana just in the last 3 or 4 years. The amount of change, the speed of change, the degree of change among older generations that's translated into policy change has been phenomenal. And these issues matter on a moral level. But so does the question of what kind of planet we want to live in and what kind of planet we're going to pass on to future generations. And Mike Harcourt and I were talking about this. He showed me a picture of grandchildren. And that is the thing that ultimately unites the interests of the young with older people. It's that sense of we have an obligation. Will we do enough about it? I happen to think we will. Thank you.
Get the house lights turned up, please. Ladies and gentlemen, we have mics in 3 or 4 locations here. It's your opportunity to go to a mic, introduce yourself, and very briefly, you could ask a question to the panel, but what I'm really looking for is to the points that were raised by our panelists, from Mike on his point of cities, from Mike Brown to the issue of innovation and capital, to Mary in the role of youth and entrepreneurship into the future, to Marc in terms of some of the key platforms of change that need to occur, and latterly to Bruce in terms of how opinions change and how that drives change. Speak to how you think one thing, how it goes. If you're asking, don't ask the question to a particular panelist. Make your point. If there's a commentary, I'll go with that. Jim.
Thanks, Chris. Jim Harris. This panel was the second time we've heard fusion cited as the solution, and I just get a bit frustrated because McKinsey has told us there's $2 trillion of energy efficiency that isn't being pursued currently. And oil and gas subsidies, the UN and IEA peg at $730 billion a year. So I think some of the solutions are fairly obvious and simple, and what is needed is the political will. We don't need R&D into unproven technology like fusion.
Thanks, Jim. Brent.
Thanks. My name is Brent Gilmore. I'm the Executive Director of Quest. My question is to Michael Harcourt. Mike, you mentioned about the challenge for cities and how we're going to respond to their infrastructure deficits. The other side of that equation is they've got a lot of energy challenge as well. What do you see as some of those solutions going forward for here in Canada or abroad?
I have to declare a conflict. I'm the chair of Quest. And by the way, we have a conference at the Bayshore December 1st and 3rd, if you're interested.
I tried.
In solutions, in implementing solutions. I think that energy is the Cisco of bringing about sustainable cities. If we change the way we do energy and look at energy conservation, look at what's called exergy, which engineers tell me is use the right source of energy for the right purpose. In other words, you shouldn't use electricity to heat space or water. And if we use local sources close to where the energy is consumed, if we use local renewables, whether it's biofuel or geothermal, solar, wind, and if we start to have the Canadian Electricity Association and other utilities start to adopt innovation as a centerpiece of replacing the $350 billion of infrastructure of generating, distributing, transmitting infrastructure that the Canadian Electricity Association guesstimates through the City House study that they're going to have to replace. If we look at energy as a way of changing the way we do city planning and city policies and integrate it into sewer, water, waste management, transportation, and change our thinking, I think we can substantially, as I gave you the example of Guelph, we can substantially, Chris, reduce the amount of energy we consume and substantially reduce, as a centerpiece of a Canadian energy strategy, for example, the greenhouse gas emissions, just by changing the way we live. So I'm quite optimistic that energy is going to play an increasingly important role. And I'm not as pessimistic about about fusion as the previous commenter. I think that we were within 3 to 5 years potentially of having fusion energy, not the laser, not the magnetic, but pounding plasma. And Mike Brown talked about General Fusion, which is a Burnaby company. I think we're within 3 to 5 years of potentially having a demonstration project up and running, and that's a game changer.
Good. I'm going to go over here. I know the comment that Jim made and the comment that Brent made, I see fusions in the comments, because they're saying, Jim's saying, look, let's go to where the payoff's the best, and it's energy efficiency. You're saying redesign it with the right kind of configuration of technology. Yes, please.
Donna Jones from insight2action.com. Couple of questions and observations. First, an observation. The whole business of disruptive innovation, I think, is paramount, because the boiled frog thing that you mentioned, Mary, is pretty relevant. We're beyond boiled. These are the conversations that I have been involved in since 1980s. I was at the Globe Conference in 1990 and 1992. We're still talking about the same things. The good news is that there's more people engaged and there's more business engaged. So as part of being the boiled frog thing and working with change makers worldwide, I can't help but wonder what it is that we can do, or what it is that helps you recognize when you're beyond fried that you can do something different. So first of all, thoughts on how we can do something different from a business mindset point of view in particular.
Okay, I'm going to give you that one question, but I'm going to move on to others because I got a lot of people to get to. So on that question, I wonder if Mike Brown and Mary can comment. If we're in this point of denial, which you both spoke to, how do we shift? Mike first.
From a policy perspective, I think it's going to be really, really hard to shift. 2 reasons. First of all, even if you did change policy, I'm not sure government's got access to resources to implement anything other than rules, regulations, and I'm not sure we're going to get there by way of rules and regulations. You might get there by changing tax policy on things like subsidies to the oil and gas business. Yes, that's possible, but it seems from a political perspective to be really, really, really hard to do because of the embedded interests that those industries have already. On the denial side, I think we've got to be very careful when we talk about, and I know that Bruce is keen on the business of the miracle is the human mind and the ability to actually put things into place. I think that's an extremely optimistic perspective, and I admire people who are optimists. But one of the things I got out of this book that I mentioned, and maybe I should get a royalty in there. What do you think, Mike?
I'll be yours.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Is this phrase that optimism, and especially undue optimism, is the denial of reality. And unless we're prepared to be really, really focused on the nature of how serious the problem is, I don't think we can find good answers. And I think we need access to the very best minds, and those come from unusual places. I will tell you that most of the time, they don't come from big corporations. They don't come from academia. They don't come from government. So I've had a little bit to do with the growth of the data wireless business in this town for 35 years, the fuel cell business for 25, the fusion business for a while, the quantum computing business for a while. Not one single one of those potentially world-changing things came from academia, corporations, or government. They all came from the fertile minds of brilliant but somewhat off-center people. And if you probably can't be the kind of genius we require unless you are off-center. And it's not a joke. And so one of the things that we have to do as a society is encourage those kinds of opportunity to show up. We need a lot more of that.
So I'll be fairly quick on this. I think the best illustration of all with respect to how you move that opinion and awareness and therefore move policymakers, because that's what moves us, right, is the McDonald's example. I have watched numerous policy initiatives snake their way through caucus, and they seem like a good idea at the beginning, and the moment that the elected person goes back to their hometown and people start walking into their office and saying, "What are you doing with this thing?" And when they come back, they've changed their minds. They don't want to take the heat. We, at this conference, at other discussions, I'm the Minister of Environment, so I spend a lot of time talking with people about the environment. We're our own worst enemies because we use language that Fred and Martha don't use every day at home. And we talk about things that are just too big for them to grasp hold of. We don't spend a lot of time thinking about how to express to them the potential benefits to them of government action or corporate action in a certain direction. People respond to what they can feel and touch and what they can attach to something that they understand in their everyday life. And we don't do very well at that. We use language that we all understand, but I'll tell you, when you start going out to other parts of British Columbia who, buy Tim Hortons rather than Starbucks and haven't heard what a latte is, you start talking about climate change and global warming, they think you're asking them to convert to some new religion. If you start talking, though, about clean air, clean water, the preservation of our natural spaces, they get it. So if you want to move the policymakers, we have to get better at talking to the people who vote and pay the taxes and expressing the initiatives that we want to undertake in a way that they can get, that they can grasp hold of, and that doesn't seem just like another, CNN documentary or something they might listen to on CBC. Nothing against CBC.
Fergal from the International Society of Doctors for the Environment. I was wondering what the panel thought of the recent NASA report warning of the imminent collapse of our civilization. And the main points, apart from the climate issue, was the collapse of our ecosystem and ecosystem services, but also the social inequality in the world. And then I have one comment, if you'll allow me. I think Mary Polak made the comment that we need to hear from our youth, we need to hear from people in general. Well, you have heard from people, you have heard from our youth in a huge way. And if you take the Rio conference, the Future We Want document, 90% of that document was written by major groups, including youth, and 90% was rejected. And I'm not talking about green hippie stuff. I can give you examples. For example, the Lumos Conference on Environmental Law gave 36 concrete recommendations on environmental law, well thought out by international jurists. Not one of them got into the future we want. So governments are being constantly told by youth, by major groups, by NGOs, all ignored. This happens at the UNEP, it happens at the climate talks. They're not listening.
I'm always struck by the tension between those who, when they think about what's happening in society on these issues, are preoccupied with why it's not working, why the public concern that everybody says that they share isn't translating into the action that they feel is necessary. Because when I look at the world as I see it today, relative to what I saw 25 years ago, I think the more appropriate question is, why is it not working better or more quickly? But I don't see the evidence that it's not working at all. I do see, across a range of sectors where I've worked, transformational change in business practices. Sustainable certified forestry is a good example. When I look at the automotive marketplace, I see a lot of change. Obviously, there can be more. When I look at the presence and the prominence of recycling programs in our urban centers, that didn't exist when I was a little boy. So I see, however halting and minuscule some of you may see these changes, I see some pretty fundamental changes having happened. I just mentioned a few. The question of whether or not we're on the precipice of a disaster, I think really goes to the heart of not so much why politics can't fix this, but there's a certain dialogue of the deaf in our society between those who say, we need to do something because we must feel despair about our imminent demise, and those who say, don't talk to me about our imminent demise, talk to me about hope and the things that we can do day in, day out, the inspirations that we can find, the things that we can invest in that maybe don't require all of the governments of the world to sign complex, long-term arrangements together, but require a little bit of money to create a solution that saves a little bit of water or improves efficiency in energy in a business or in a community or in a remote area. I think that there is plenty of evidence if we are willing to look at it. And the conversation that has been most bedeviling to me to watch has been that some of the most enthusiastic advocates for environmental improvement don't speak to their neighbors in a way that is as effective as it could be. And part of it is because of the frustration that they feel about it's not going fast enough, it's not working, nobody's doing the right thing. And the other part of the audience is saying, well, let's talk about what we can do. And part of that is that people wanting to have a conversation about climate change, and lots of people saying, I'm happy to have a conversation about the environment, about air, about water, about wildlife, about landscape, about greenhouse gas emissions. But that dialogue has been tortured for some time.
Yeah, very quickly, Bruce, I agree with you. There's a lot of reason for optimism, the way we think about the environment. I think your example of gay rights is a hugely encouraging one, transformational change in a short period of time. That said, the NASA report cited by the speaker, the IPCC report, what Mike Brown has said here, the evidence is that on the climate issue, we are moving in the wrong direction literally every day. And although it's nice you want to be optimistic, and there are breakthrough technologies, we need to be very tough-minded in our optimism about the scale, seriousness, and difficulty of that problem.
Okay, I'm Richard Adamson with Carbon Management Canada. I'm involved right now in a very exciting project internationally called the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project, which involves 13 countries looking at a bottom-up approach in each of their economies. What would a deeply decarbonized world in 2050 look like? Simultaneously prosperous. So you're looking at triple the global economy and on track for 450 parts per million. Very interesting process because kind of a mistake that's implicit, I think, and pardon me, but I'm being blunt, that's being made in all of the assumptions here, is that we are the market. That this future is going to be selling stuff to us, and we are irrelevant in terms of the market and in terms of the level of emissions going forward. The rocket that's driving this planet on all fronts is in Asia and Southeast Asia and Africa ultimately. But what's really exciting is those countries are also looking at deeply decarbonizing. The question I'd really like to have answered is, where do you see the real opportunities in terms of the market? Just indulge me, if you will, in a fantasy. Supposing the world actually does care about climate and starts to turn the corner and starts making those massive commitments towards decarbonizing on a worldwide basis, where do you see the opportunities for us to contribute in that world?
I think there are some. Notwithstanding the gentleman over here is not very happy about the fusion idea. If that thing works, you could imagine being able to get electricity at around about 5 cents kilowatt hour. The cost of the fuel is 1/100th of a penny per kilowatt hour, and it's called heavy water, and it exists in all of us, and it exists in the ocean, and there's only about 40 billion years worth of it on Earth. And it uses no weird materials. Those things are going to be capable to be made by anybody who can make an airplane. So just imagine for a minute, electricity at a nickel. That means you can take, if you could find the carbon dioxide cheap enough, you can make any liquid fuel you like for less than the cost of gasoline today. So that changes not just the market for electricity. There are no emissions here, by the way. There's no radioactivity and there's no other emissions. The other one is further away. It's probably 12 years away, where some people who have developed some nanotech ideas believe that they can extract carbon dioxide from the atmosphere for something in the order of $5 a ton. $5 a ton. You can't get natural carbon dioxide out of the ground for less than 70 today. But $5 a ton. Now that means you could afford to split the carbon and the oxygen. And if you can split the carbon, it's just a big pile of black stuff you can put in the ground and put a concrete layer over the top. And the oxygen, you either sell it, goes back into the atmosphere. But if you could do those things on a massive scale, carbon dioxide is completely fungible. It doesn't matter where you take it out of the atmosphere. If you could do that, those two things alone are the quality of the miracle that we need. If you could get them done. But the problem is how much money it's going to take to get them there. I don't believe the governments have a role in doing that, apart from supporting private sector. The private sector's got to come up with the money. Private sector's got to figure out how you turn those opportunities into real companies. And those people I talked about before, the geniuses, and I know I said something that might be misinterpreted, and I said they're a little off-center. You and I aren't capable to do this, most of us. The odd one out there probably is. But don't forget, a miracle and a breakthrough means that somebody has been thinking about things in a completely different way. And the problem is, those people aren't recognized often enough for what they bring and what else is necessary to put around them. And as a society, we've got to figure out, what do we put around them from a private sector perspective? So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. David Buckland. I run a project called Cape Farewell over from London in England. What we do, what we are, our job, our role in a sense is to be the kind of the communication between everything we've been hearing at this conference and make it public facing. So we're the kind of the tool that actually makes this, broadens the scale of the amplification of what you've been saying. We've just started a project called Energy Renaissance. And now what I've been hearing from the conference is that, yes, we can get the energy, we can deliver a non-carbon-based economy through the energy. There is the finance available if we can only but unlock it. But the key word is renaissance, is that we're walking towards a culture that in 10, 15 years could be completely different, a completely renaissance, a cultural shift. And if we're going to get to the place where we can have a non-carbon energy sector, or sort of a carbon-free economy, then in a way the game shifter might be a completely cultural shift, a re-looking at the future, and not to be scared, so to somehow frame the future as something that we shouldn't be scared of, but that we should be truly excited by. And one of the things I would have liked to have had is more debate within this conference of the power of a cultural shift.
My name is Warren Walker. I'm from Churchill, McGee, and UBC. There's a classic, just a classic phrase in The Graduate, was talking about, there's a fellow talking, I think it was Dustin Hoffman, that said, son, the future's in plastics. Well, I would like this panel to declare that pipelines and oil tankers, super tankers, are non-starters, and what is the future in? Sustainable economies? I think so, but I'd like you men to say that.
My question is, what examples can you provide where you've spoken with people in key leadership roles that have been effective and made them think critically, turn the light bulb on? So did you recommend a book? Did you explain the issue in a particular way? What was it that kind of triggers that response where people actually want to make that change?
It's not a book, and I'll give an example, but it's not from my cabinet colleagues. It's actually from a trip to the US that we made during the Pacific Coast Collaborative signing of the action plan. And it was giving a presentation to the governors of California and Washington and Oregon, being able to talk about the carbon tax in a practical way now that we had the evidence of a few years of experience. And all that I could talk about in terms of the theoretical meant nothing. When I was able to say, look, there's a simple equation here. We've had the carbon tax in place now for a number of years. The result is emissions are down, while at the same time GDP is up. It takes back to some of what you've heard myself and others say up here. People want to understand, feel, touch. They want to get that there's more than just fixing our 50-year from now problem. I mean, it's bringing it down to here, it actually works, and I can show you it works. That's not easy, but maybe it's when politicians have to do this all the time, and that is sit in front of an audience or sit in front of an individual, and in your mind, you ask yourself, well, what is it that's going to speak to them? It might be different than what speaks to the other guy, but what is it that speaks to them? We got to know our audience. We got to identify those green consumers, and we've got to be able to speak their language.
I've had two conversations that I'll recount variations of. One with people in the business community that I've worked with in different sectors, particularly in the extractive sectors where there's been a lot of pressure on their businesses and their reputations over the last couple of decades. And the recurring conversation that strikes me as being maybe the most interesting and important one I've ever been able to have is that moment in time where the corporate executives say, I'm tired of being beaten up publicly. What do people want? And the impression that they have is that people want something that's radical and impossible and unachievable in their business model. And I'm usually the person who's able to say people want effort, they want improvement, they want to see a track record, a commitment, and some evidence of results. And if they don't see that, they will want government oversight and they will want sanctions and they will want penalties. But I've never yet run into a business leader who, when given the opportunity to take the first option, didn't take it. So that's one reason why I think that that kind of conversation about not the art of the possible, but making sure that people understand this connection that people have between I want to accommodate you doing what you do, but I want you to accommodate my value system alongside that. That's a very important dynamic. And the second one is a conversation I've had with people in politics. And politics loves things that look binary. They're black or white, red or blue. Forgive me for not mentioning orange, but it doesn't fit into my binary metaphor. But The truth about Canadians when it comes to their attitudes towards sustainability and environmental issues is that we are not purely pragmatists. We are not purely idealists. We are pragmatic idealists. And we probably stand out in the world as being the best examples of pragmatic idealism that I am familiar with. And we live our lives that way all the time. And to presume that we're going to discard our pragmatism and embrace idealism exclusively, that's not going to work, and it doesn't work when it gets tried in political terms. And one of the reasons why I think Elizabeth May, who's here somewhere today, has become a well-liked public figure and a success, in my view, in Canadian politics, no question about it, is because people understand the way that she talks about environmental issues is tinged with that sense of pragmatism about how we live our lives. So in politics, convincing politicians that you don't have to be against radical environmental solutions or for pure idealism when it comes to the environment, that's been a very helpful conversation too.
I find that we all have profound solutions, like ideas for our energy problems, water problems, and we like to do, say, research on our ideas. But then I find one thing is that it's rather very, very difficult to actually to get some funding for our thing. And it's not easy to get in touch with, say, the big corporation, because they are the ones who has the money and the capital for that. And so, I would like to use this opportunity to ask the panel, and how we, as younger generations, to solve that problem.
Finally, as we close this globe and we go to the Globe Awards and the last couple of activities, as we close and stand up, I'd like you to go and find two people you've never met before and give them your business card. And the people in the questions, please do come up to stage. Thank you very much.